Hello, everybody, and welcome to our lecture for this week, which is on invitational skills. So, invitational skills is kind of a broad category, are the skills that we are using to invite the client into the relationship, and then we are using kind of consistently to maintain the relationship. So, these are skills that are really critical to the therapeutic relationship. They're also just good interpersonal skills to have, generally speaking, but that we know within the therapeutic relationship, these are absolutely critical to any therapeutic work. That's why we cover them kind of first and foremost, because this really is kind of the foundational. How are we going to interact and show up for our clients and invite them into the relationship? So we'll start with active listening, and you may have heard this term before, but it seems like maybe the number one skill as a counselor is listening, and not just kind of passively listening to where you're just kind of taking it in, and then once the client's done speaking, you say whatever you really want to say. It really is about actively listening. So that means listening to understand. It's very different than listening to respond, right? So if we're listening to respond, we are listening to what the person is saying, but we're just picking up on little bits and pieces of what they're saying, and in our minds, we're going ahead and forming the next thing that we are going to say, right? So we are actually, in our minds, we're trying to listen, but we're also forming responses as we go. And it's a very natural thing to do, especially in just kind of everyday conversation, but when we're talking about a counseling relationship, and particularly when you're learning to do this work, really listening to understand. So you're listening for little nuances in what a client is saying, such as tone of voice. We'll talk about some of these things we look for, but you are really listening for what the client is saying, what they're not saying, how they're saying it, the context, and then how they are literally saying it in terms of voice tone and pace and facial expression, all those kinds of things. So it really is a kind of a deeper form of listening than we typically do in our everyday interactions with folks maybe that we're not working with in a therapeutic sense. We are going to learn how to attend and encourage without intruding. That's the point of active listening, is not to constantly be jumping in on what someone is saying, but to very naturally encourage them to continue talking or to continue sharing and exploring without necessarily having to say things sometimes, and then also definitely without intruding too much in terms of kind of jumping in while the client's talking. We're not going to fix, right? This goes back to what we talked about last week in terms of our job as counselors is not to provide solutions. It's not to give advice. It's not to say, go do this and your problem will hopefully go away. And so active listening is not solving. It is listening to understand the client and what they're going through. And then it is also letting the client lead the conversation. So that doesn't mean we don't say stuff, and it doesn't mean we don't maybe ask a question to get the conversation going, but or to take it in a different direction or to keep it going, whatever. But it does mean that we are letting the client communicate to us what they feel they need to communicate. And so it really is it's making the process very client-centered. That's a term we use quite a bit in the field, and it's meant to get at this idea of the client is the one who's guiding the dialogue. They're the ones who are telling us what they need to talk about, and are really the ones kind of creating a path for where the counseling process goes. Obviously, we are giving it some structure and helping them along, but it is the client who's setting the agenda. So with invitational skills, there's kind of two broad categories, and we'll talk about both of them with a little more depth in the upcoming slides, but we have nonverbal skills and then we have opening skills. Nonverbal skills are what they sound like. They're the skills that don't necessarily have anything to do with the actual words we are saying or that our clients are saying, but they are all the other communicative skills that we use that aren't those words, right? And so we'll talk about what those are here in a minute. And then opening skills are exactly what they sound like. It is how do we help the client kind of open up to the process, open up to exploring, to sharing, to doing work in the therapeutic relationship. So we'll talk about each of these with a little more depth here. So nonverbal skills, you can see kind of some of the big categories here on this slide. So these are skills that we're going to utilize to be non-intrusive while the client is talking, to let them know we are with them, we are listening, we are understanding. And so we use things like silence. I think silence is a really helpful tool as a counselor. When you are not saying stuff, you are sending a message to the client that this is their session, this is their work, this is their process. Yes, we're here to help, but this is for them. And so kind of erring on the side of silence first instead of always kind of jumping in can really help it be more client directed and kind of communicate non-verbally to them that this is their work to do and we're going to give them the space to do it. There's lots of physical stuff, right? Just body position, body posture, facial gestures, eye contact, all the things about how we present ourselves when we are sitting in front of a client are communicating to them that we are present, that we are listening, that we understand them, that we're not thinking about other things in our lives, we're not doing other work. It is, we are there for them. And again, this is whatever context you're working in. So these skills can be translated into a lot of different contexts. It's just, how do you convey full presence to someone is what we're talking about here. Tone of voice can also be really helpful to be intentional about, knowing kind of what your natural tone of voice is, just in your everyday conversation. And then being natural in your counseling work, but also at different points being very intentional about using different voice tones, whether you're kind of matching the clients or whether you are intentionally mismatching. We'll talk about that here, I think, in the next slide or two about why you might do that. But all these things impact the way a client feels in session, right? Or the way they feel in an interaction if you're just having a briefer interaction with them. It really does impact their experience, and it can be very invitational. I mean, I'm sure we've all had interactions with people, whether there's a counselor or not, who are just very engaging, right? Like, when you're with them and you're talking with them that they are fully present, that they are listening to you, they are understanding, and that's what we're trying to do here. We're trying to do it very intentionally. All right, so why does this stuff matter? So there's lots of research on nonverbal communication, and there's some different numbers that I've seen around how much of communication is nonverbal, but this is they're usually around this number, which is 80%. That's a lot, right? I mean, that's 4/5 of our communication coming across, not in what we are saying, but in everything else we're doing. So it really is a big part of how we communicate as human beings. And then when we get into looking at how emotions are communicated, and I think the researchers have focused on emotions in particular in communication because most people come to counseling with some type of emotional distress taking place, right? So they may not come in saying that they are depressed or they are anxious. Maybe they're coming in with kind of a behavioral issue, whether it be a kid in the schools or someone is struggling with substance use, and they come in with a very kind of behaviorally oriented presenting issue or goal. Still, that's going to be very emotional laden. It's having some kind of emotional consequences, and those are being communicated somehow. So that's why a lot of the research is focused on emotions. But 38% of emotions are conveyed by voice. That's huge. It's not just what they are saying; it is how they are saying it. And same for us. A client could tell you they're depressed in a very matter-of-fact way, or a client could tell you they're depressed in kind of a slow, kind of quiet way. And those two things are communicating different information to us as the counselor. And so that's just an example. So, we want to think about how we are communicating what we're seeing emotionally from clients as well. A little over half of emotions are conveyed by the face, so paying attention to facial expressions can be really helpful in giving us clues. Clients don't always come out and just say what it is that they're feeling. You might have a very kind of emotionally aware and expressive client, but you might also have clients that don't kind of readily tell you how they're feeling, and facial expressions can be one way, very helpful way to kind of for us to begin understanding what their emotional experience might be, even if they're not necessarily saying it. So that is a very helpful way to think about facial expressions as kind of a window to the emotional life without clients having to talk about their emotions. And then, only 7% of emotions are conveyed verbally, so that's not a ton, right? I mean, that's, again, if you have that kind of emotionally aware and articulate client, more power to you. It's less work on our part if we have that individual sitting in front of us. But not many people have that, right? I mean, not many people come in with kind of this robust set of emotional vocabulary and then the awareness to go along with it that allows them to kind of fully communicate their emotional experience. And then the nonverbals do provide a window into client incongruence. Kind of back to my example a second ago about a client who comes in and just kind of matter-of-factly says that they're depressed, or even says it with like a smile on their face, and like there's a mismatch, right? Like when we think about depression, we think about at least depression in kind of a clinical diagnosable sense. We're talking about someone who is really struggling, someone who has a hard time feeling or seeing any hope. And so if their verbal expression of that mismatches what we know about depression, that is helpful for us clinically to understand and to work with, right? So generally speaking, we're trying to help clients become more congruent. And so any kind of incongruence you're seeing between what a client is saying or how they are saying it or expressing it can be a really helpful clinical kind of data piece to be thinking about. All right, eye contact is really helpful, as I'm sure we all know. Talking with someone who is making eye contact with you is just one strategy or one method for showing that you are fully engaged, right? And so obviously this does not mean like staring someone down, but this does mean making regular eye contact. So it does convey that we're confident, that we are involved, with our clients' conversation and what's going on in the room. It does add potency to verbal communication. So there is a level of relational intimacy that comes along with making eye contact, especially in a kind of a vulnerable moment. It can be really helpful to make that eye contact when they're kind of opening up or exploring something that might be hard for them to explore. And then, being aware of cultural differences. Not all cultures make eye contact the way kind of Western cultures do, or even, here in the U.S. that we do. So just being aware of that, having that cultural understanding of yourself and the client can help you navigate the appropriate amount of eye contact with a client. Body position. So we do want to be both relaxed and alert. And that can sound kind of contradictory, but we do want to, you don't want to be like, leaning forward, sitting like super posture style and just look like you're on the edge of something, like you're going to get up at any moment. That's not going to help the client feel comfortable and at ease. So you can sit up, don't be slouching or sitting in a recliner or anything, but like be attentive, be like you are comfortable, right? Like you're not going to have to be fidgeting, or you're not working super hard to hold yourself upright, but that you are attentive. So you want to be both comfortable, relaxed, but also conveying that you are fully present and attentive. And then generally speaking, you do want to have an open posture, meaning I don't want to sit there in a session and be all kind of like, closed off physically, right? Being closed off physically can communicate to the client that you are closed off or that they should not open up. And so we want to be really intentional about maintaining an open posture. Now that does not mean that like if you are most comfortable like sitting with your legs crossed, it doesn't mean you can't do that. But it does mean we just in general want to be aware that we're not like sitting with our legs twisted like a pretzel and then, having our arms crossed like this. We want to be open to communicate openness to the client. All right, attentive silence. This allows, on the client's part, if we don't jump in to say something every time the client finishes talking, what it does is it allows the client time to reflect. And so not filling every silent moment by jumping in can be helpful for the client to reflect, especially if you notice that they've said something that is resonating with them, or that they're thinking about it, or that it has brought up an emotional experience. Not jumping in right away can just give them a moment to process or think about what they're experiencing. And then a lot of times clients will take that silence, they'll use it how they need to use it, and then they'll say something afterward. And it can be really helpful to see where they take it. Where does their awareness take them, versus us kind of jumping in and taking them to a particular place. Silence also provides time for us to process things. Clients will sometimes give us a lot of information, or that they'll have maybe an unexpected reaction to something. It could be any number of things, but we can use silence to allow ourselves to think for a second, to try to understand what's happening, to try to think of where the most helpful place is to go next. Obviously, we don't want to do this every single time the client, finishes talking. That would be a weird rhythm to the, any kind of therapeutic conversation. But occasionally, we do want to use silence to give space for us to think about what to do next. What we do know that silence does is it encourages disclosure on the client's part. It encourages depth, meaning, if a client is sitting there thinking, they are more likely to come out with an answer or an understanding or self-awareness that is deeper than maybe if we had just asked a question next or something like that. So it also encourages a client to stay with emotion. So if a client is having an emotional reaction to something and we allow that, we just kind of invite it into the room and we stay silent with it, it kind of sends a subtle message that it's okay to have those emotional experiences in the room, and it doesn't take the client away from it. So if the client were having an emotional reaction and we were to jump in and say, "What are you feeling?" which is an emotionally directed question, it's going to take the client out of kind of the in the moment experience of the emotion, and now they're going to be thinking about the emotion, if that makes sense. So instead of having kind of an emotional experience with us in the room, now they are thinking about what emotion it is that they're feeling, which is more of a kind of a cognitive, analytical way of thinking. So there's lots of reasons to use silence very intentionally. This is also a skill that I know a lot of individuals, including myself when I first started counseling, are uncomfortable with. I was uncomfortable with it. It's a normal social conversation does not have long periods of silence. Silence can be very awkward in a social setting, whereas a therapeutic setting, we are wanting to use it as a technique. We're wanting to use it very intentionally. All right, voice tone. Voice tone gives us some of the emotional clues. Like I said earlier, clients may not be coming out and kind of explicitly talking about what they are feeling, and so voice tone can be really helpful for us to listen to and to try to understand what that tone is communicating. Clients also respond to our tone. So whether we are talking kind of upbeat or in a joking way, depending on where the client is and where the conversation is, or whether we are kind of intentionally slowing down our conversation, talking a little lower, talking a little slower, that is going to have an effect on the dialogue and where the client goes with things. So we can use our voice tone very intentionally. It also is something, most of the time we want to mirror our client. Most of the time, if a client slows down their pace of speech, gets in that kind of low and slow way of talking, we want to mirror that. There are exceptions to that. So if a client maybe is demonstrating incongruence by talking about something like depression, and they are talking about it very kind of fast and upbeat, we might intentionally try to mismatch that to facilitate congruence, if that makes sense. So if a client is talking about depression and they are talking kind of fast and they're a little upbeat about it, and it's like this mismatches our image of depression, we can talk lower and slower, try to slow the client down and see if we can help them become a little more congruent with their depression in the moment. And so you may think that like the opposite could be true for something like anxiety. When we think about anxiety being a little more like fast paced, and now my mind's racing and now my heart's racing and all these kinds of things, we might try to mismatch the client for whatever reason around anxiety to either get them to feel more or less anxious. There are definitely cultural considerations that we want to take into play when we're talking about nonverbal communication. There's been some interesting research around facial expressions, and this is not universal, but the research has found that for primary emotions, meaning those kind of the major emotions we know everybody has, happiness or joy, sadness, anger, those kinds of emotions, facial expressions are generally consistent across cultures. So that's helpful, right? I mean, it's, sadness is probably going to look pretty similar for most of the clients that we see. And when I say look similar, I don't necessarily mean look similar in terms of how it shows up in their life and the effect it has on them, but I mean like literally it looks similar when it's sitting in front of us. That's the kind of similarity we're talking about here. Physical distance norms do vary across cultures. So in the U.S., it's about 5 feet optimal for a counseling environment. You may or may not have control over that, just depending on your setting and the space, the environment that you are seeing clients in, and but it can be helpful just to know that, right? Like generally speaking, 5 feet ish is a helpful distance to be away from your client. And touch, in a good rule is just like don't touch your clients. Touch, physical contact comes with all sorts of messages, and so we want to be really intentional about not confusing messages with a client, because counseling relationships are one that have very intentional and very clear boundaries, and physical touch is one behavior that can make boundaries confusing. And so, there are some exceptions to this. Like, we don't have to think about this in the absolute extreme. Like, shaking hands with a new client is not going to be the end of the world. It's just like a nice social thing to do, right? I used to work with little kids, and I remember one of the things, it just happened to be that a lot of the kids that I would work with, boundaries, and particularly boundaries around physical touch, were really critical. They were part of the work, meaning either the client had either inappropriately touched someone or they had been inappropriately touched at some point. And so I remember thinking about this technique or this skill a lot more than I had previously, which is like touch is really powerful. And so I remember, kids often, once they get to know you, like they'll run up and hug you and stuff. And I always had a strict, like, we don't hug in here rule with kids, and that's just probably a good rule to have in general. But we would come up with like handshakes, right? And so it was like a special handshake that involved touch. It was a welcoming thing, to do with a client instead of a hug that was much more appropriate. So those are a couple examples of like, it's not to say like you can't ever have any physical contact with your client ever, but it is saying if you do, it should be very intentional and should not ever be used in combination with negative messages, right? I mean, that's just a good skill in general, meaning, we're not touching a client in some way and telling them they shouldn't be doing something, or communicating anything like shame, or that they're not doing things right. Just want to be very intentional. That's a potent combination. There's a lot of literature around parenting and that you shouldn't be communicating negative messages along with the physical touch. It can be those two things get bound together in a really unhelpful way. It can be used effectively. Now that I've told you not to do it, it can be used effectively if you know the client well, and its use is appropriate. And so there are some instances where physical touch can be helpful, and things like I have had clients who at the end of a therapeutic relationship might want to give you a hug or a handshake or something. Like it's up to you to make a decision whether or not you're okay with that, but I think it's all about knowing the client, how do they respect boundaries, and then being very intentional about if you are going to introduce physical touch in some way, be very thoughtful about how you're doing it. All right, so that covers most of kind of the nonverbal things. So we're going to talk about opening skills, which is kind of two broad categories of opening skills. We've got encouragers, which are exactly what they sound like. They are meant to encourage the client to keep on talking, to keep on sharing, and then we've got questions. So encouragers, there are two primary types of encouragers, door openers and minimal encouragers. Door openers are things that we say to the client that literally kind of, or metaphorically, kind of open the door for them to share, right? And so they are ways to allow the client to start a conversation, to take the conversation in the way that they want to go. And they often buy us some time to try to understand what it is that the client's saying. So things like, can you tell me more? What's on your mind? They are literally very open-ended, right? I mean, it's like, I'm not hunting for anything here. I literally want to know where you're at. What are you thinking? What's on your mind? And it lets the client know that this is about them and where they want to take things. Minimal encouragers on the other side of the encouragers techniques are techniques that we use to let the client know throughout a conversation that we're present, we're listening, that we want them to keep talking. So there are, I just said that's a potential minimal encourager. The little things that we introduce into our dialogue, like okay, right, gotcha. These kinds of things that we might say, even if there's like a small break in what a client is saying, and we're like, oh, gotcha. What we are doing is we are communicating to the client, I'm listening, I understood what you just said, keep on talking. Right, and so we can do them verbally, like the ones I just mentioned, but we could also do things like head nods. That is essentially saying okay to the client, and that we understand what they're saying. Eye contact is another kind of minimal encourager. We are demonstrating to the client we're listening, and we want them to keep on talking. So those are all ways that we can minimally encourage a client to continue their dialogue in whatever direction they feel they want to take it. So you may feel, once you bring attention to this, you may feel like you are a bobblehead. Like if you start really paying attention, like how much am I actually nodding to my client? Or you may find that you have a go-to minimal encourager or two that you say over and over and over again. That's normal. It almost happens to everybody. I remember mine was gotcha. I had a supervisor who called me out on saying gotcha a lot. And ever since then I was like, oh yeah, I gotta watch that. And so we all do have these small kind of natural ways of encouraging people to talk. And so just pick up on them, notice what they are, and if you want to vary them up, you can. All right, questions. Counselors, I think, can rely too heavily on questions, or we can rely too heavily on questions, just especially when we're learning to do the work. We feel like if we know everything, or if we get all the data from the client, then we'll be able to kind of put it together and then present it back to the client, and voila, your problem is solved. And questions are generally how we get information. So they are easily abused for that reason. We can rely too heavily on questions. They can actually distract from what a client needs. Because if you think about what a question is, it is we are selecting a very specific piece of information to gather. And we are making that choice, the counselor. And that's not to say that we don't want to ever do that, because we do. That can be really helpful and they can be really powerful. But if that is all we are doing, that means that we are directing the bulk of where the conversation goes if all we're doing is asking questions about this, and then they answer, then we ask another question, then they answer, then we ask another question. So we just want to be really thoughtful about using questions in a very intentional way and not overdoing it. It can feel like an interrogation or an evaluation on the client side of things. So if they're doing nothing but answering our questions, they're not actually sharing what they want to share, then it can just not give a great feel to the relationship. And we do know there's been some research in any case that beginning counselors ask too many questions or they ask the wrong type. And so too many questions is what it sounds like. You're relying too heavily on questions to structure the dialogue with a client, or the wrong type, and we're going to talk about the types here in a minute, but types of questions that elicit very specific information are not generally the most helpful questions to ask. If we want to ask questions that put the onus on the client and the autonomy on the client to talk about what they want to talk about. So questions to very kind of explicitly avoid are why questions, and why questions are just questions to start with why. Why do you feel this way? Why did you do that? Why, those kinds of questions. And we want to avoid them because first, they can be experienced as accusatory, like why did you do that? It has this sense of like this undercurrent. It can have this undercurrent of you shouldn't have done that. Why'd you do that? And so we want to avoid that, right? Because there's judgment embedded in there. Remember, we're trying to be non-judgmental. It also intellectualizes things, meaning kind of like a few slides ago when I was talking about if you have a client who's experiencing an emotional reaction and you ask them about the emotional reaction, it takes them to their head and now they're thinking. That's what this intellectualization means. A client is going to be thinking about why they feel something or why they think something or why they behave a certain way. And that is a very intellectual space, a very intellectual process to be in. And so we want to be careful about kind of continuously taking clients to an intellectual place because we don't want to kind of over intellectualize in a counseling session. We don't want to hypothesize and theorize and get over intellectual about what we're talking about with our clients. Because generally the work is not there, right? The work is not in the intellectualization part of counseling. And then leading questions. Leading questions are giving advice in a different form. And so a leading question might be, the one I think I've heard most often, particularly in this course, has been, have you thought about trying ... Which is really saying, you should probably try ... right? And so it's fishing for a solution, but disguising it as a question. And so we want to be careful about leading questions. They are generally pushing our own ideas or our own agenda onto the client in a very subtle way. And we know that they don't lead to kind of depth of understanding or depth of exploration on the client's part. All right, so there's two big kind of categories of questions, open and closed. So closed questions are ones that are very specific in the answers that you're going to get to them. So it's either going to be a yes or no, or something kind of short and factual, like an appropriate closed question, like what's your birthday, right? If you're gathering information, because you're going to get a date. It's not a yes or no, but it's very specific. So they can be helpful in, like if you're needing to clarify something with a client, that can be a good use. If you're gathering data at the beginning of a relationship with a client, you just need to know some things. Closed questions can be really helpful. But in the general therapeutic process, we want to be really careful about using closed questions because they can stop the conversation very quickly because they are very specific in what they're gathering. And so generally when that happens and a client gives us that information, whether it's a yes, no, or a short factual thing, there's not kind of a natural flow into the next thing. And so want to be careful about that. And over time, they can develop a dependent relationship, meaning the client is going to look to us to begin structuring things because that's how we've structured them. We're the ones who ask questions. We're the ones who ask. All right. Sorry, y'all. I had another glitch in the camera here, but in the recording, but I think where I was at when the recording cut off was the examples here. So these are just some examples of closing the questions. Are you angry about that? That's going to be a yes, no. Would you like to do something differently? Yep, I would. When did that happen? That's a factual question. Are you employed? These are factual questions. So again, they can be helpful for very specific purposes. We just don't want to rely on them too much for the counseling process. There we go. So open questions. These are the ones we want to rely on more heavily. So questions that encourage more depth and self-direction, meaning a client gets to kind of pick where the answer goes. And so they're more helpful for clients. They are less coercive, meaning we're not putting our agenda out there as much. We are letting the client kind of guide the conversation. And it does get more information that's important to the client. So they get to pick what they share. So things like, how do you experience anger? That is very different than, are you angry, right? Yes, no. How do you experience anger? What was it like? What was your reaction when that happened? So it's just opening up for the client to answer. I will say, if you're ever working with a client who's not much of a talker, maybe they don't share readily what they're thinking or don't open up to their experience, open questions are much better to get them to talk, to get them to actually share, because it's hard to answer a open question with a yes or no or a very short factual thing. Generally the answers need to be a little longer. So it gives more dialogue for the counseling process. Oh, that's it. All right, y'all. Well, I hope that was helpful, covering invitational skills, nonverbal, as well as, some of the opening and questioning formats, opening skills. So these are, like I said, these are foundational skills, right? I mean, we're going to be using these throughout the counseling process, regardless of where you are in the counseling process and regardless of, if theoretical orientation or presenting issue or setting. These are just generally good skills to be utilizing. So use them in life, right? I mean, eye contact and body posture and these things, we can practice this all the time. So you don't have to wait until our mock sessions in class to practice these. Be very intentional about paying attention to these things, and the work will progress a lot quicker for you if you're able to do that outside of class. All right, y'all. Look forward to doing some work around this when we get into class, and hope you have a good rest of the week.